9 guests Johnny Carson found creepiest. For 30 years, Johnny Carson welcomed over 22,000 guests to The Tonight Show couch. From Hollywood legends to political figures, from comedy icons to everyday people with unusual talents, Carson interviewed them all with his trademark blend of charm, wit, and genuine curiosity. But not every Tonight Show interview went smoothly. Behind Carson's affable on-air persona was a keen observer of human behavior, a man who could instantly sense when something wasn't quite right with a guest. While Carson maintained his professional demeanor regardless of the situation, those who knew him well could detect subtle shifts in his body language, timing, and energy when certain guests made him genuinely uncomfortable. Johnny had this amazing ability to maintain his composure on camera no matter what was happening, revealed a longtime Tonight Show producer who worked with Carson for over a decade. But backstage, he would occasionally admit that certain guests had genuinely unsettled him. Not because they were difficult or combative, Carson could handle that, but because there was something inexplicably disturbing about their presence or behavior. Today we're revealing the 9 guests who most deeply unnerved television's most unflappable host, the celebrities whose appearances left Carson visibly unsettled and prompted private comments about their disturbing qualities. From manic intensity to eerie stillness, from slurred incoherence to cold hostility, these are the encounters that made even Johnny Carson uncomfortable in his own studio. But first, let's understand why our first entry created such an unsettling atmosphere. An appearance by one of America's most celebrated literary figures that left Carson feeling like he was interviewing not a person but a spectral presence from beyond.
And they were on the gallows, each one of them, for over 20 minutes before.
Number 1, Truman Capote, Ghost at the Mic. Truman Capote was one of America's most celebrated authors, known for literary masterpieces like In Cold Blood and Breakfast at Tiffany's. His distinctive voice and eccentric persona had made him a talk show staple throughout the 1960s and early 1970s. But as Capote's struggles with addiction worsened, his appearances on The Tonight Show took an increasingly disturbing turn that genuinely unsettled Carson. Capote in his later years had this quality that Johnny found deeply unnerving, explained a director who worked on several of Capote's Tonight Show appearances. He would speak in this wispy, barely audible voice, trailing off mid-sentence into these long pauses, then suddenly continue as if no time had passed. Johnny said it was like trying to interview a ghost who kept fading in and out of our dimension. During one particularly disturbing appearance in 1975, Capote arrived visibly intoxicated and launched into rambling, disconnected monologues about death, celebrity secrets, and paranormal experiences. Rather than the witty, gossipy guest Carson had expected, Capote projected an almost otherworldly quality that created palpable tension in the studio. The audience didn't know whether to laugh or be concerned, recalled a camera operator who worked that night. Capote was slurring so badly you could barely understand him. But it wasn't just that. There was something almost spectral about his presence. He kept staring past Carson into empty space, then smiling at nothing. Johnny kept looking where Capote was looking, clearly unnerved. The interview became so incoherent that producers made the rare decision to cut it short. During the commercial break, Carson reportedly turned to his producer and said, "He sounded like a haunted house whispering its own memoir." When the show returned, Carson announced that Capote wasn't feeling well and moved on to the next segment. What made Capote particularly disturbing to Carson wasn't just his intoxication. The host had dealt with impaired guests before, but the combination of his physical frailty, his whispered intensity, and the disturbing content of his rambling stories. One writer who was present for the appearance recalled, Capote was telling these half-coherent stories about people he claimed had died under mysterious circumstances, then giggling softly. Johnny kept trying to lighten the mood, but Capote would just stare at him with this unsettling smile and whisper, "You don't really believe that, do you, Johnny?" While Carson maintained his professional demeanor throughout the appearance, those who knew him well could see he was genuinely disturbed. A longtime associate recalled, after the show, Johnny said, "I don't mind difficult guests, but that was like interviewing someone who's halfway into the afterlife already." He was genuinely creeped out, which almost never happened. The experience was so unsettling that Carson temporarily suspended Capote from the guest list, not as punishment, but because the host found the experience so genuinely disturbing that he didn't want to repeat it. When Capote was eventually invited back years later, strict precautions were taken to ensure he was in better condition, but Carson reportedly remained wary throughout the interview.
Ich weiß jetzt, ich habe Sie zu schnell unterbrochen, das war meine Schuld. Aber ich weiß jetzt, was ich Sie...
Number 2. Klaus Kinski, Wild-Eyed Rage. German actor Klaus Kinski was known for his intense performances in films like Werner Herzog's Aguirre, The Wrath of God, and Nosferatu the Vampire. His volcanic temperament and unpredictable behavior were legendary in the film industry. When Kinski appeared on The Tonight Show in the late 1970s to promote a new project, Carson encountered a level of manic intensity that left him genuinely concerned for everyone's safety. From the moment Kinski walked on stage, there was this crackling, dangerous energy, remembered a stage manager who was present that night. He had these wild, bulging eyes that never blinked, and he was literally trembling with some kind of internal rage. Johnny, who normally leaned toward guests, was actually leaning away from Kinski throughout the interview. What made Kinski's appearance particularly unsettling wasn't just his intensity, but the disconnection between Carson's questions and Kinski's responses. When asked about his recent film, Kinski launched into a rambling diatribe about art, religion, and the approaching apocalypse. When Carson attempted to interject with a lighthearted comment, Kinski fixed him with a stare so hostile that the audience audibly gasped. "We had security staff on high alert that night," revealed a producer who worked on the show. "We weren't sure if he'd finish the interview or flip the desk." During the commercial break, we actually discussed whether to end the segment early for safety reasons. Johnny was incredibly tense. I could see him calculating exactly how to handle this unstable person without setting him off. The interview continued with Carson maintaining a facade of calm while subtly creating physical distance between himself and Kinski. According to crew members, Carson later said it was the only time he had seriously wondered if a guest might become physically violent on air. Johnny told me afterward that he felt like he was sitting next to a bomb that could explode at any second, recalled Ed McMahon in a later interview. He said, "I wasn't conducting an interview so much as trying to prevent a public meltdown. I've never been so relieved to go to commercial." What particularly disturbed Carson was Kinski's eyes, which never seemed to blink and maintained an unnervingly intense focus throughout the segment. A camera operator who worked that night remembered, Johnny said later that looking into Kinski's eyes was like staring at an approaching storm. You could feel the destructive power building and knew something terrible was coming. The Kinski appearance became legendary among Tonight Show staff as the gold standard for disturbing intensity. For years afterward, whenever a particularly difficult guest was scheduled, producers would reassure Carson by saying, "At least it can't be worse than Kinski."
No, I didn't win. I didn't win. I didn't lose either. There was no trial. There was nothing. As a matter of fact,
Number 3. Robert Blake, Cold Stares and Hostility. Robert Blake had established himself as a respected actor through his work in films like In Cold Blood and the popular television series Beretta. His reputation for intensity and authenticity made him a potentially interesting Tonight Show guest. What Carson couldn't have anticipated was the wave of barely contained hostility that Blake would bring to his appearance, creating one of the most uncomfortable interviews in the program's history. "Blake came on with this inexplicable antagonism," explained a writer who was present for the appearance. "It wasn't just that he was difficult. Plenty of guests were difficult. It was the cold, dead-eyed stare he fixed on Carson whenever Johnny asked a question. There was something genuinely unnerving about it, like he was mentally calculating how to do Carson harm." From the moment Blake settled into the guest chair, the atmosphere in the studio changed. Rather than engaging in the usual light conversation, Blake gave clipped, sarcastic answers to Carson's questions, often challenging the premise or responding with a hostile, "Why would you ask me that?" When Carson attempted to use humor to diffuse the tension, Blake would stare silently for an uncomfortably long time before dismissing the joke with a curt remark. "The air just went dead in the studio," recalled a stagehand who witnessed the exchange. "The audience stopped laughing. The band looked uncomfortable. It felt like he wanted to fight, not talk." Johnny kept trying different approaches, sincere questions, light banter, but Blake just sat there radiating this cold anger. What made the appearance particularly creepy wasn't just Blake's hostility, but the contrast between his controlled exterior and the sense of barely contained rage beneath the surface. A camera operator who worked that night remembered there was something deeply unsettling about how still he was. He barely moved, barely blinked, just stared at Johnny with these dead eyes while speaking in this eerily calm voice that didn't match the hostile content of what he was saying. Carson, drawing on all his professional experience, maintained his composure throughout the segment, but those who knew him well could see subtle signs of his discomfort: a tighter smile, a tendency to consult his note cards more frequently than usual, and a physical posture that created maximum distance between himself and Blake. Johnny told me afterward that he felt like he was being studied rather than having a conversation, revealed a producer who spoke with Carson after the show. He said, "I don't mind if someone doesn't like me, but Blake wasn't just unfriendly. He was observing me like a specimen. I felt like I was being sized up by a predator." The experience was so unsettling that Carson made sure Blake wasn't booked again during his tenure as host. Years later, when Blake became embroiled in legal troubles, Carson reportedly remarked to a colleague, "I'm not surprised. There was something genuinely disturbing about that man's energy. I've rarely felt so relieved to end an interview."
The middle I go fool, treat me mean and cruel, but love me.
Number 4, Andy Kaufman as Tony Clifton, absolute chaos. Andy Kaufman was already known for his boundary-pushing comedy when he appeared on The Tonight Show as his alter ego, lounge singer Tony Clifton. While Carson appreciated Kaufman's more controlled appearances as himself, the Clifton character, intentionally obnoxious and confrontational, created an atmosphere of genuine discomfort and chaos that left Carson uncharacteristically rattled. The Tony Clifton appearance was unique because it was intentionally designed to be disturbing, explained a Tonight Show producer who was present that night. Most uncomfortable guests are accidentally difficult, but Kaufman was deliberately creating an unsettling atmosphere as part of his act. The problem was, it went beyond performance into something genuinely creepy. Clifton arrived on set already in character, wearing an ill-fitting tuxedo, a bad wig, and oversized sunglasses, reeking of cologne, and behaving belligerently toward staff members. From the moment he sat down, he violated every unwritten rule of Tonight Show etiquette, interrupting Carson repeatedly, insulting Ed McMahon, making crude remarks about female staff members, and refusing to follow any of the conversational cues that typically structured the show's interviews. It wasn't just that Clifton was obnoxious, recalled a writer who witnessed the appearance. There was something genuinely unsettling about watching someone who refused to break character even when things were clearly going off the rails. Carson would try to establish some kind of normal conversation, and Clifton would respond with this disconcerting non sequitur delivered in that grating voice. You couldn't tell if Kaufman was in control of the character or if the character had somehow taken over. The segment reached its breaking point when Clifton, apparently dissatisfied with the band's accompaniment to his intentionally terrible singing, threw a glass of water toward musical director Doc Severinsen. At that point, Carson took the extremely unusual step of walking off his own set, leaving Ed McMahon to handle the increasingly chaotic situation. Johnny never walked off. That's how disturbed he was, explained a stage manager who was present. When he left, Clifton actually got worse, refusing to leave the stage when the commercial break came. Security had to physically remove him while he shouted obscenities. It was beyond uncomfortable. It was like watching someone have a psychotic break, except you knew on some level it was an act, which somehow made it even more disturbing. When Carson returned after the commercial break, he was noticeably tense, a rare crack in his typically unflappable demeanor. According to staff members, he later expressed that what disturbed him most wasn't Clifton's obnoxious behavior, but the total commitment to the character, regardless of consequences. Johnny told us afterward, "I've dealt with drunks, egomaniacs, and people having meltdowns, but there was something genuinely unsettling about someone who refuses to acknowledge reality," remembered a longtime associate. He said it was like talking to someone who exists in an entirely different universe with different rules. That level of commitment to chaos creeped him out. The aftermath was swift and decisive. While Kaufman himself remained welcome on the show and made several subsequent appearances as himself, Carson personally requested that the Clifton character be permanently banned. As one producer put it, Johnny could handle difficult, but he couldn't handle disturbing, and Clifton crossed the line from difficult to genuinely unsettling. Number 5, George Jessel, racist relic. George Jessel was an old-school vaudeville performer and film producer whose career stretched back to the early days of the 20th century entertainment. By the time he appeared on The Tonight Show in the early 1970s, he was in his 70s and represented an entertainment era that had long since passed. What Carson couldn't have anticipated was how Jessel's appearance would create one of the most uncomfortable moments in the show's history. Jessel came from an era of entertainment where racial and ethnic jokes were standard fare, explained a writer who was present for the appearance. But by the 1970s, those kinds of jokes weren't just unfunny, they were appalling. Carson, who prided himself on keeping the show current and respectful, was completely blindsided by what came out of Jessel's mouth. The trouble began when Carson, after a brief introduction, invited Jessel to share some thoughts about his long career in entertainment. Instead of the light reminiscences Carson expected, Jessel launched into what a crew member described as a greatest hits of the most offensive material imaginable, a monologue filled with racist terms, stereotypes, and humor that might have passed in the 1920s, but was shocking to the 1970s audience. The studio went completely silent, recalled a camera operator who witnessed the moment. Not the uncomfortable silence where people don't get a joke. The horrified silence where everyone is collectively thinking, did he really just say that? Johnny's face froze in this pained smile. You could see him frantically trying to figure out how to stop this train wreck without creating an even bigger scene. What made the appearance particularly unsettling wasn't just the offensive content, but Jessel's complete obliviousness to how his material was being received. As the audience sat in stunned silence, Jessel continued as if expecting uproarious laughter, occasionally looking confused when it didn't come. Carson was trapped in an impossible situation, noted a producer who was in the control booth that night. If he directly confronted Jessel about the offensive material, it would create an on-air confrontation with an elderly man. If he laughed it off, he would seem to be endorsing these horrific views. If he abruptly cut the segment, it would be awkwardly obvious why. He was visibly uncomfortable in a way I'd never seen before. Carson's solution was to cut to a commercial much earlier than planned. When the show returned, Jessel had been replaced by the next scheduled guest. According to staff members, Carson was uncharacteristically upset backstage, telling his producer, "That was not what this show is about. That kind of thing is never happening again on my watch." While many difficult guests were eventually invited back after a cooling-off period, Jessel was permanently removed from Carson's guest list. The incident prompted the show to implement more thorough pre-interviews, particularly for guests from earlier eras of entertainment. What disturbed Johnny most wasn't just the offensive content, explained a longtime associate. It was the way Jessel seemed to be a visitor from another time who didn't recognize or acknowledge how the world had changed. There was something genuinely creepy about someone who seemed completely disconnected from contemporary reality. The Jessel incident became a reference point for the production team. Whenever potentially problematic guests were suggested, someone would inevitably ask, "But could we have another Jessel situation?" The mere mention of the name was enough to make bookers reconsider.
Don't you like men's clothes?
All the time? No, I don't do it all the time. They're my work clothes. I mean, a lot of people pick up a work pail and...
Number 6. Divine, a shock to 1970s America. Divine, the drag performer who rose to fame through John Waters' transgressive films like Pink Flamingos and Female Trouble, was already a countercultural icon when booked on The Tonight Show in the mid-1970s. With an elaborate beehive wig, dramatic makeup, and a deliberately provocative persona, Divine represented everything mainstream 1970s America found challenging, making for an appearance that visibly unsettled even the normally unflappable Carson. This was long before RuPaul's Drag Race and mainstream acceptance of drag performance, explained a talent coordinator who worked on Divine's appearance. Having Divine on a mainstream network talk show was genuinely shocking for the era. Johnny, who was fairly traditional despite his progressive booking choices, was clearly out of his comfort zone from the moment Divine walked on stage. What made Divine particularly unsettling to Carson wasn't aggression or hostility. By all accounts, Divine was professional and well prepared for the appearance. Rather, it was the deliberate subversion of gender norms and societal expectations that created a palpable tension throughout the interview. Carson remained courteous but was visibly unsettled, recalled a director who worked that night. He kept a slightly greater physical distance than usual. His laugh was more nervous than genuine, and he was off his rhythm for the entire interview. You could tell he was struggling to find the right approach. Should he treat Divine as a serious artist? As a novelty? As a provocateur? He never quite figured it out. The studio audience's uncertain reaction added to the uncomfortable atmosphere. Some laughed nervously, others sat in confused silence, and network censors were on high alert for any content that might violate the era's strict broadcast standards. This created a strange energy that Carson, normally so in control of his environment, struggled to navigate. Johnny was caught between his responsibility to make guests feel welcome and his obvious personal discomfort, noted a writer who was present. He kept glancing at Ed McMahon like he was silently asking for help. When Devine made references to John Waters' films, which were famously transgressive, Johnny had no frame of reference. He clearly had no idea how to respond to mentions of the infamous scenes that had made Devine famous. While Carson maintained professional courtesy throughout the segment, those who knew him well could see his relief when the interview concluded. A producer later recalled, "As soon as the cameras stopped, Johnny turned to me and said, 'Well, that was certainly something different for the folks in Omaha tonight.' It was his polite way of saying he'd been completely thrown off balance." What makes Devine's appearance particularly significant is how it highlighted Carson's struggle to bridge the gap between his Midwestern sensibilities and the rapidly changing cultural landscape of the 1970s. Despite his discomfort, he never treated Devine disrespectfully, a testament to his professionalism, even when genuinely unsettled. The Devine interview became something of a watershed moment for The Tonight Show, demonstrating that Carson was willing to feature guests who challenged conventional boundaries, even when they clearly made him personally uncomfortable. As one staff member put it, Johnny might have been creeped out, but he never let his personal reactions get in the way of giving the audience something genuinely new and thought-provoking.
The graveyard of ghost tales. I can't imagine anybody who could tell them any better. Would you welcome Mr. Vincent Price?
Number 7. Vincent Price, theatrical and ominous. Unlike most entries on our list, Vincent Price was a frequent and welcome guest on The Tonight Show. The legendary horror film star brought a unique combination of sophisticated charm and theatrical menace that made for entertaining television. Yet even as Carson clearly enjoyed Price's company, crew members noticed that the host seemed genuinely unnerved by certain aspects of Price's dramatic persona. Price was one of Johnny's favorite guests, but there were moments when he genuinely gave Carson the creeps, explained a longtime Tonight Show producer. Vincent could be talking about something completely ordinary, cooking or art collecting, and then suddenly slip into that ominous voice he used in horror films. When he did, you could see Johnny physically recoil, even while laughing. What made Price's appearances uniquely unsettling was his ability to seamlessly transition between charming raconteur and sinister presence. During one memorable segment, Price was invited to read Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven, with the studio lights dimmed and candles providing atmospheric lighting. As Price's voice grew increasingly intense, cameras caught Carson's genuinely disturbed reaction. Johnny later said that for a few moments during that reading, he completely forgot they were on a television set, recalled a director who worked on the segment. He said Price's voice seemed to physically change the temperature in the room. After the show, he joked, "I think Vincent actually summoned something during that performance. Did anyone else feel a presence in the studio?" Carson often noted that Price made even compliments sound like death threats, an observation that contained a kernel of truth about the actor's unsettling vocal quality. During one appearance, Price brought Carson a gift, a mounted taxidermy bat in a small display case. Carson's reaction was a complex mixture of politeness, genuine interest, and visible discomfort as he handled the preserved creature. Johnny had a real fascination with Price, but also a genuine unease around him, noted a writer who worked on several of Price's appearances. It wasn't that he disliked Vincent, quite the opposite, but there were moments when Price would fix him with this intense stare or lower his voice to deliver some dramatic line, and Johnny would get this look like he was thinking, "Is he still acting, or should I be worried?" What made the dynamic particularly interesting was how aware Price seemed to be of his effect on Carson. He would deliberately play up his macabre persona, sometimes bringing prop spiders or rubber bats that he would suddenly produce to startle Carson. These moments created a playful tension that audiences loved, but that genuinely tested Carson's composure. There was one appearance where Price was discussing a horror film he'd recently completed, remembered a camera operator. He was describing a particularly grisly scene and suddenly reached out and grabbed Carson's wrist while speaking in this chilling whisper. Johnny literally jumped in his chair. Afterward, he told us, "For a second there, I thought Vincent was actually going to bite me." Price's ability to unnerve Carson while remaining one of the show's most beloved recurring guests highlights an important aspect of Carson's psychology. The host could appreciate and even enjoy being occasionally unsettled when it was part of a performance by someone he respected, a very different reaction from his response to guests who were unintentionally disturbing. As Carson himself once remarked after a particularly theatrical Price appearance, "Vincent is the only person who can terrify you and make you hope. He comes back to do it again soon."
Through the books, right?
Absolutely. And my father and mother also.
And the drinking.
Yep.
He was an alcoholic.
Number 8. Margot Hemingway, Disturbing Spiral. In the late 1970s, Margot Hemingway was one of the world's top models, the face of Fabergé's Babe perfume, and granddaughter of literary legend Ernest Hemingway. Her appearances on The Tonight Show were initially glamorous and charming, but as her personal struggles intensified, her final appearance in the early 1980s created one of the most genuinely disturbing segments in the program's history. Hemingway came on for what should have been a standard promotional appearance for a film, but it was immediately clear something was very wrong, recalled a producer who worked on the segment. She was disoriented, her speech was erratic, and her eyes had this vacant, glassy quality. Johnny, who was always sensitive to guests in difficult situations, looked genuinely concerned rather than just professionally uncomfortable. What made Hemingway's appearance particularly unsettling wasn't aggression or hostility, but a profound sense of disconnection from reality. She would begin answering Carson's questions, then trail off mid-sentence, staring into space for uncomfortably long periods before suddenly returning to the conversation with no acknowledgement of the lapse. At other moments, she would respond to questions Carson hadn't asked, creating an eerie sense that she was participating in an entirely different interview than the one actually taking place. Carson kept trying to find solid ground, explained a writer who was present that night. He'd ask simple, straightforward questions, hoping for coherent responses, but Hemingway would answer with these rambling, disjointed statements that made no logical sense. You could see Johnny becoming increasingly concerned, not annoyed or impatient, but worried for her as a person. The audience's reaction amplified the disturbing atmosphere. Instead of laughter or engaged attention, the studio fell into uncomfortable silence, broken only by occasional nervous coughs. Carson, normally so adept at managing audience energy, seemed unable to break through the discomfort that had settled over the room. Johnny gave shorter and shorter responses as the segment continued, noted a director who worked that night. It wasn't rudeness. It was his way of trying to minimize the damage. He was clearly uncomfortable, but more in the way you're uncomfortable when witnessing someone in a genuine crisis than when dealing with a difficult guest. What made this appearance particularly poignant was the context that would later emerge. Hemingway subsequently revealed her struggles with addiction, bipolar disorder, and the pressure of living up to her family name. The Tonight Show appearance captured a woman in the midst of a deeply troubled period, something Carson seemed to intuitively recognize. After the segment, Johnny was unusually quiet, remembered a stage manager. When someone made a joke about Hemingway being out of it, Carson shut them down immediately, saying, "That wasn't someone being difficult, that was someone in trouble." He was genuinely disturbed, not by her behavior, but by what it revealed about her suffering. Years later, when Hemingway's life ended tragically by suicide in 1996, several Tonight Show staff members recalled that troubling appearance as a warning sign that had been clearly visible but not fully understood at the time. As one producer reflected, "Johnny was disturbed because I think he sensed the gravity of what we were witnessing. It wasn't just an awkward TV moment, it was a cry for help playing out on national television."
This is like sitting at the World's Fair, riding one of those Ford machines.
Number 9. Andy Warhol, The Dead-Eyed Silence. Andy Warhol's appearance on The Tonight Show in the early 1980s was arguably the most conceptually unsettling interview Carson ever conducted, not because of volatile behavior or concerning signs of personal troubles, but because of the artist's deliberate, unnerving passivity and refusal to engage in the basic conventions of conversation. Warhol's appearance was more performance art than interview, explained a producer who worked on the segment. He barely spoke, gave one-word answers when he did speak, and stared blankly through Carson as if he wasn't there. It created this incredibly uncomfortable atmosphere that even Johnny, with all his experience, couldn't navigate successfully. From the moment Warhol took his seat, the typical rhythm of The Tonight Show was disrupted. Carson would ask full, thoughtful questions, and Warhol would respond with a single word or a slight nod, followed by long, unblinking stares. When Carson attempted to use humor to break the tension, Warhol would offer a small, enigmatic smile that acknowledged the joke without actually engaging with it. The audience didn't know how to react, recalled a camera operator who was present that night. Was this a joke? Was Warhol being deliberately difficult? Was he incredibly shy? The uncertainty created this creeping discomfort that spread through the studio. People shifted in their seats, coughed nervously, looked around as if seeking confirmation that this was as weird as it felt. Carson tried every interviewing technique in his considerable arsenal: open-ended questions, specific inquiries about Warhol's art, personal anecdotes meant to elicit response, even direct comments about the unusual nature of the conversation. Nothing penetrated Warhol's affect of detached observation. At one point, Johnny directly asked, "Do you even want to be here?" remembered a writer who was backstage. Warhol just shrugged slightly, neither confirming nor denying. It was like trying to interview a sphinx. Johnny later joked off-air, "That man could be made of wax," but you could tell he was genuinely unsettled by the experience. What distinguished Warhol's appearance from other difficult interviews was the absence of conventional discomfort markers. He wasn't hostile like Robert Blake, intoxicated like Capote, or manic like Kinski. Instead, his presence created what one staff member described as an existential vacuum that seemed to distort the normal flow of time and interaction. It wasn't hostility, it was existential dread, noted a director who worked that night. Johnny relied on the basic human connection of conversation, and Warhol refused to participate in that fundamental exchange. Carson later said the experience felt like interviewing a ghost who knew something you didn't. It was genuinely eerie. In many ways, Warhol's appearance represented the perfect inversion of everything The Tonight Show stood for. Instead of warmth, connection, and entertainment, he offered coldness, disconnection, and discomfort. For Carson, whose entire career was built on establishing easy rapport with guests, the experience was profoundly disconcerting. After the segment, Johnny was both irritated and fascinated, recalled a producer who spoke with Carson afterward. He said, "Either that was the worst interview I've ever done, or it was brilliant performance art, and I'm not sure which would bother me more." He seemed genuinely shaken by the interaction, not angry, but disturbed on a deeper level. Warhol's appearance became legendary among Tonight Show staff as the gold standard for uncomfortable silence. While Carson occasionally mentioned other difficult guests in later years, he rarely referenced the Warhol interview, as if the experience had been too fundamentally unsettling to revisit even in retrospect.